So we'll be looking at 2 Timothy this morning and chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3, and I'm starting at verse 1. You should also know this, Timothy, that in the last days there will be very difficult times. For people will love only themselves and their money. They'll be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents and ungrateful. They'll consider nothing sacred. They'll be unloving and unforgiving. They'll slander others and have no self-control. They'll be cruel and have no interest in what is good. They'll betray their friends, be reckless, be puffed up with pride, and love pleasure rather than God. They will act as if they are religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. You must stay away from people like that. They are the kind who work their way into people's homes and win the confidence of vulnerable women who are burdened with the guilt of sin and controlled by many desires. Such women are forever following new teaching, but they never understand the truth. And these teachers fight the truth just as Jannes and Jambres did and fought against Moses. Their minds are depraved and their faith is counterfeit. But they won't get away with this for long. Someday everyone will recognize what fools they are, just as happened with Jannes and Jambres. But you know what I teach, Timothy, and how I live, and what my purpose in life is. You know my faith and how long I've suffered. You know my love and my patient endurance. You know how much persecution and suffering I've endured. You know all about how I was persecuted in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. But the Lord delivered me from it all. So it's quite a beginning to this passage. Paul writes to Timothy and he's instructing him, and we've been looking at this idea of toxic religion, a way to do faith that really is so out of character for what God's trying to teach us and how he's trying to form us as disciples, that it's fake. And so Paul instructs Timothy, who's a younger man, who's one of his proteges, and he's left him in the church in Ephesus to teach there. And he says to him, you should know this, Timothy, that in the last days there will be very difficult times. And that sounds kind of apocalyptic, doesn't it? Sounds like Mad Max or something. In the last days, like at the end of the world kind of thing. And it sounds kind of final. It sounds like Mad Max or Back to the Future 2 if you don't go for the hard stuff. Some of those movies where the future is dark and everything's wrong and there's lawlessness and everything has gone crazy. And so it sounds like that kind of picture when he says in the last days. At least that's sometimes how we picture the end. But Paul says a little later in this letter, as for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near. I have fought a good fight. I've finished the race, and I've remained faithful. So Paul's kind of at the end. He's feeling like, I'm in prison. I'm writing this letter to you guys, but I'm not sure this is going to go so well. I think this is the end of my life. So is Paul just getting really dark because he knows the end's coming for him and thinking about the end of the world? Or is it the end of the world? Well, newsflash, this was written a couple thousand years ago, so not quite that close to the end. So is Paul just misunderstanding when the end is coming? Does he picture that? Well, let's look first of all at the picture that he paints of these last days. He says, for people will love only themselves and their money. They'll be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents, and ungrateful. They'll consider nothing sacred. They'll be unloving and unforgiving. They'll slander others and have no self-control. They'll be cruel and have no interest in what is good. They'll betray their friends, be reckless, be puffed up with pride, and love pleasure rather than God. Not a really flattering picture, right? Not the kind of people that you hope will move into your neighborhood and decide to strike up conversations with your children. But if we're honest with ourselves, and if we look at this picture and we read that list, it sounds bad all put together there, but if you read any one of those statements, you'd go, I know people like that. Like I live around people like that. Some of my family are like that. And so they're not all that odd, and there's a reason for that. Paul says, even though there's, he's telling them that it's like this is what they'll be like. And even though there's no scorched earth, it's pretty bad when you look at it all together, especially if you realize that these people are moving into your neighborhood and they are the people you've got to deal with every day. And then the strangest thing of all, he goes from that list of 19 things about these people that will populate these last days, and he says, they will act as if they're religious, but they'll reject the power that could make them godly. Stay away from people like that. So he says they're religious, but they still act like that. They still walk around the world like that. And of course, we know that those are the kind of people that we deal with. And there's a reason for that. It makes sense because Jesus had said in the Gospels that these are the end days, and then talked about, about the kingdom that was to come and why we should repent. He says, it tells us in the scripture that he mentions this about the last days. So last days doesn't mean the world's about to end. Paul didn't get it wrong, Jesus didn't get it wrong, and they thought it was going to come to an end. It's just that the last days stretch from the first coming of Jesus to the second coming of Jesus. Like that era of time, that at least 2,000 years plus, right? That span of time is what he's referring to as the last days. And that's why it looks like our neighbors and our friends and the people we work with. That's why some of those character flaws are there. But then when he says they're religious, but they'll reject the power that could make them godly, he's talking about these people who their minds are depraved and their faith is counterfeit. And he's saying to them, he says, even in our churches, these are the kind of people, these are the kind of things that people get caught up in. These are the kind of flaws that people have of character and the kind of thing that they engage in sometimes. When I was a kid, Christmas was about toys, right? For most of us, when we're kids, no matter how much we're told and no matter how many Sunday school classes we go to, there's a certain part of our brains that just goes, Christmas is for toys and Easter is for chocolate. That's the kid way of doing stuff. Those are the things we get excited about. But the truth is, whether it's Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, both of those mythical creatures, they shoot blank sometimes. Like sometimes when you were a kid, you were excited to rip open that parcel from grandma and it was socks. Socks! And none of you grandparents here would do that. But when I was growing up, socks was a normal gift from grandma. And I loved my grandma. I never understood why she bought me socks. She knew I liked to play. And when it comes to Easter, Easter was about the chocolate, but sometimes you'd open up one of those chocolate bunnies and it was huge. It was just massive, like a couple of feet tall. And you thought, I got the biggest Easter bunny. It's going to take me till next year to eat this thing. Like I am going to get so sick and it'll be wonderful. And you pop it out of the box and you go to gnaw on the ear and it crunches just a little too easy because the whole thing is hollow. What a disappointment for a kid. Not solid chocolate. Somebody didn't vet the people who made that bunny. It's full of air. There's a little bit of chocolate on the outside, but most of that bunny is air. And kids get enough air, right? Chocolate, we can always use a little more. And so what Paul is talking about here, when he talks about this, he points out to them that this religion that these people have, he says they have all these character traits, and the reason that they have all those flaws, the reason that they act that way is because their religion is empty of power. It's hollow. It's like a 2-foot Easter bunny filled with air. It's like a pair of socks at Christmas. And so the power that Paul's talking about, he says that this happens and they get like this, and even religious people, even people who claim to be godly, they do that. They say, I'm a believer. I believe in God. I follow God. I'm a Christian. But there's a hollowness to how they live it out so that they aren't accessing the power that could make them godly. And so what is this power that can make you godly, and how do you reject it like that? Or more important for us, how do we not reject it? Like, how do we access the power that Paul's talking about so that we don't fall into the trap of our lives looking like this picture of these 19 ugly character traits? And so if you look at the list of 19 character traits, you'll notice something. If you look at these 19 character traits, you'll find that 6 of them are related to love. And so Paul points out to them that they love only themselves and their money. And then a little later down the list, he says they're unloving. Like they don't love anything. And they have no interest in what is good. The word there, that no interest, it's the same word that they used for love. It says they don't love what's good. Like their love isn't pointed at what's good. And then at the end of the list, he says they love pleasure rather than God. They love pleasure, but they don't love God. They love pleasure a lot, but they don't love God as much as they should. And so they've chosen pleasure over God. It's kind of a binary choice, and they've picked pleasure. And so if you look at those things, they've got no interest in what's good, and they love just flip the screen there. They love themselves, it says, and their money, and they're unloving, so they don't love anything that's sensible. And then they don't love, it says they don't love anything good. They don't love the good, and they love pleasure, and they don't love God. And if you look at those 6, if you boil them down, you understand something about the way that their love is. Their love really is all focused on them. And so when it says they're unloving, it doesn't mean they don't love anything, but they don't love the right things. Like they don't have the right kind of love. And when he points out that they don't love anything that's good, that's the problem. And they love pleasure, but they don't love God. The problem is that they love themselves more than they love God. They're interested in what will make them feel good and what will give them pleasure and what will fill their lives with what they want. And even in their religion, they approach it that way. See, there's a way to do church where you come and say, I'd like to sing what I want to sing, and I'd like to hear what I want to hear, and I'd like to feel good at the end of it. And it's good if you feel good sometimes when you finish church. I mean, there's some church services, maybe you shouldn't feel good. Sometimes God can challenge us, and hopefully this is a safe place for him to do that. But there's this sense in which they love themselves so much, they're so focused on what they want and what they get, and it becomes self-serving to the point that they're excluding God from the equation. And whenever there's a choice between how I feel and being true to God, I'm going to choose how I feel. I'm going to default to that as my motivation. And so it boils down to that they love themselves more than they love God. It's a sad truth that they live out their faith that way. But even as believers, they treat it like a way that they can rub the lamp and get the genie to come out and grant them a wish. And there's a different way to do it, and Paul says that's why they don't have access to the power, because the power of God isn't a wish-granting kind of power. The power is pointed in a certain direction. The power of God has one usage: to make us godly. like to shape our lives so that we look more like Jesus and we walk around and we're more loving like he is. And so John Wesley always said, none but the righteous are finally happy. Like there's no way really to happiness or satisfaction except by being righteous. But if your goal is to be happy and you choose happy over God, then you will never be righteous. And ironically, the happiness that you're seeking, you'll never reach it. Because the true happiness is not the frothy, bubbly feeling that you get when you get your way and when you get what you want. It's the sense of satisfaction that comes when you know that your heart is doing what it was designed to do and your life is pointed in the direction it was made to be pointed in. And you're moving in a direction that is so positive that everything feels right about it. And so then Paul points out, he gives us his example of what that looks like. And so, on the other hand of how these people are looking at it, Paul says to Timothy, but you know what I teach, Timothy, and how I live, and what my purpose in life is. You know my faith and how long I've suffered. You know my love and my patient endurance. You know how much persecution and suffering I've endured. You know all about how I was persecuted in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, but the Lord delivered me from it all. What a different picture of a life. Paul points out to Timothy that there's one way of living that leads to that selfishness that makes you go around slandering people and living unforgivingly and considering nothing sacred and having no self-control and being cruel. You can live that way so that everything you do, whether on purpose or by accident, if you're focused on just yourself and what you get, then you're automatically going to kind of pick up some of those traits. And you're going to be reckless, and you're going to betray your friends, and you're going to be puffed up with pride. But Paul says that's not the way this is supposed to look. And so he says to Timothy, here's what I found that's a better way. You know what I teach. And you can find these things, this list of characteristics. So Paul says, it's about what I teach, like there's my the true teaching of the Scripture. And if you understand that, if you look at what the true teaching is, it'll begin to shape your life. And so Paul teaches Timothy about this true teaching. And then he says to him, Timothy, you know how I live. And he points out, this is how I live. You've seen me do this. And he says, what my purpose, and you know what my purpose in life is, and you know my faith. You know how I've suffered, and you know how much persecution and suffering I've endured. You know my love and my patient endurance. And so Paul's character traits, they're different than the ones in the other list. If you could just change the screen there. And so he gives them the true teaching, and he says, you know how I live, and you know my purpose, and you know my faith, and you've seen me love and be patient in suffering. And here's how I do that. I am dependent on God's power. Like all these times that I suffered, all these times that I was persecuted, all these times that the whole world seemed to be against me, and I still survived. Like they stoned me and left me for dead a few times. And how do I get up and I go back to doing this? And why would I be motivated to go back into the same town and preach the same gospel that got me stoned last time? Why would I keep doing this? Because I'm dependent on God's power. And God's power shows me the true teaching. Paul wrote 2/3 of our New Testament. Like if you flip to the second half of the Bible past the Old Testament, you go to the New Testament. If you flip the page open, 2 out of 3 times you're going to hit one of Paul's teachings because he wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. This guy that used to persecute Christians, that used to go around and drag them out of their homes and charge them because they weren't following the right way. And then he encounters Jesus and his life changes, and he teaches this teaching, and he follows it himself, and he lives the way that God's called him to live. And he has this sense of purpose that means he knows what he's supposed to be doing. And it lines up right. And so he has faith, and he's able to go around being truly loving, not directing his love towards satisfying himself, not using love as a tool to get what he wants, but loving God so much that he loves everybody else, and he can be unselfish in his love. And so he can be patient even when he's suffering, because he loves the people that are making him suffer, because he wants them to know about Jesus. And he wants them to find real life and real forgiveness and real life transformation. And Paul can do all of that because he's dependent on the power of God. And so it's kind of a binary choice. We can do life, we can even do our Christianity with an absolute powerlessness. Like we could hollow it out and say, it's about how I feel, and I'm going to pray for what I want, and I'm going to go for what I want, and I'm going to insist that the church do what I want, and everything about it is going to be about whether I get something out of it, and whether it's for me, and whether I like it. Or I'm going to try to encounter the living God who wants to transform me and change me and make me unselfish and teach me how to serve. And Paul says, look, if you've got a powerlessness, if you feel like it's not really working for you, you're not tapped into the power. And if you're trying to use that power for anything else other than to become godly, it won't work, because that's its only purpose. That's the main thing God's trying to do, is to shape you and to make you like Jesus. So Paul says if you do that, then you'll find you love the right stuff. And your love isn't pointed at all the wrong things that make you end up with that deformed character where you're doing all that stuff even though you don't want to. And sometimes you don't even like yourself very much, but he says there's a way of even doing religion that can be pointed at all that instead of at Jesus and at his kingdom and at what God wants to do. And Paul says you can do it that way, but Timothy, you know the right way. I showed you. I taught you what I was taught. And it's not because Paul thinks he's such a great example. Look at me. He says, I'm the chief of all sinners. But if God can do it in me, man, Timothy, he could do it in you. And every single person that you encounter in the church, he can do it in them if they allow him to do what he wants to do. He is powerful, and his power can be manifest in your life, and you can see it at work, and it can do incredible things in you. But it's not just there to do what you want. It's there to do what he wants. And he's going to keep trying until he gets through. So there's a fake, a counterfeit, a hollow kind of religion that has basically no impact at all. And you walk around looking like everybody else in the world, looking out for number one. And maybe even trying to use your faith to do it. Or there is a way to live that creates incredible satisfaction because you live by faith and you love Jesus and you love everybody else because you love Jesus. And so you're patient even when you suffer because you are tapped into the power of the living God that is at work in you, and that power can do stuff that you can't even imagine. But it can't be wielded for what you want. You can set it loose and let it do what it wants to do, and it will be a wild ride and an incredible adventure, and your life will have meaning and purpose and be filled with faith and marked by love. Or it cannot. And the choice is a choice that each one of us has to make.